Hello, Rajan. Congratulations on release of the book. How are you doing?
Whereas, congratulations to you too.
Yeah,
Great, I'm doing great. So how was the
yeah.
event?
Awesome. I think it was totally rocking speaking to a lot of people. Think importantly, what I loved is when I interviewed a lot of people, not a single person told they are afraid of AI. Everybody says that AI is just a tool. So the way they compared it is like, hey, previously we were going by cycle or by walk, and now I have a car. I'm driving 100 miles per hour. Uh, but
Optimistic of people.
yeah, of course, and they said that as a result of it, now I go from point A to point B faster, but it also means that I need to travel more. I used to only travel 100 miles. Now I need to travel 1,000 miles. But the way, be it developers or be it other people who are seeing this tool, they see it as a way to accelerate what they need to get done. So in that way, I find a lot of positivity, which is what I liked. And I always am a strong believer of hope and positive embracement of technology. So in that way, I think I found it really powerful in terms of experience. So now
Awesome.
we'll come back to the book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Let's talk
So
about the
let's
book.
speak. Yeah. So I'll share my screen so that we sort of like ground everyone on like what are we speaking about? What is this book? So to everyone, we are releasing this book called Model is the Easy Part. And it's all about harness engineering for coding agents. Rajan, for us to dive in, can you start by sharing what is harness engineering? How do we define it? And why this book?
So every few months, I think, we come up with this new term. First, it
Hmm.
was prompt engineering, there was context
Hmm.
engineering, and then founder of AI Engineers Conference, Swix, he literally had come up with multiple names saying agentic engineering, things like that. But I think there is a convergence in the last couple of months on saying that, we should talk about harness as a separate thing, different from context. And the metaphor that I rate to really use is models, whether it is Opus 4.5 or Codex and others that are there out in the market. The best way to think of them is that they are engines inside a car, right? And we are really looking at it and saying that, how powerful they are. We're using SWE-bench, we are using HLE, Humans Last Exam, these type of benchmarks to actually say, hey, how good is the engine when it has to actually turn sand into intelligence, right? That is really
Hmm.
what those things are about. But then when you have to do a certain job in a specific industry, a certain type of workflow that you have to deal with, then that engine is going to power a lot of activity that you will do, but that is, cannot stop there, right? So you need to build the chassis and the car around it. So harness is really about that scaffolding that is there, which uses these LLM engines and then runs them in a loop, calls them, connects them with a API, fetches some other data, earlier used to be called as RAG, does some tool calling, and also brings all the structured unstructured data and then stores inside the context in a way it can actually do some function or do some objective, like go from point A to point B. So all that scaffolding that we will do around the use of a model is called as harness. And how is it different from context? Context is purely about saying what is the data that you're going to fill inside the context or context area that will help you actually get to that function. So it is more about like filling that particular spot, but all process that you follow, how do you actually do? How do you sequence it so that you're able to, let's say, do a much better job of like a financial use case or like a coding use case? That part, that scaffolding is what is called as harness engineering, and that is important to call out. So that way, if you really think about cloud cowork is a harness, cloud code is a harness, personal computer from Perplexity is a harness, open code is a harness. We don't think about them that way, right? And maybe call one of them as coding agent, and then another one we say, hey, this is cloud code for non-tech, cloud cowork. But all of them are basically using these LLMs in a certain loop, in a certain tool call, in a certain structure, in a certain sequence to actually do a particular use case much better. And the more you go into a specific vertical, the more you have to actually create more nuances. Maybe you have to do some compliance check and things like that. So I love the new like convergence of this term called harness, which is talking about the scaffolding around the model. I guess like we'll eventually come to some terms like MVC or something like that, but we are pre MVC phase when it comes to the harness.
That's well said, Rajan, and especially for the people who don't really use Cloud Core, the way you put it, right? Cloud Core work is a harness, so it gives them a dimension saying that it need not be limited to coding use cases as well. Could be finance or could be anything they may be doing in their day-to-day work. So just we'll give a quick peek into the book as a next step, and we'll probably cover a few chapters alternatively. So we'll start with you, right? You
So,
set the
Karthik, as
frame.
we do this, why don't I actually talk a little bit about the agent harness, right? The framework that you built and
Yeah.
a lot of the experience that we have brought into the book.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did is we started building the agent harness, which is nothing but orchestration of multiple agents in order to solve a vertical specific coding problem. For example, when we look at an organization is like a civilization or a culture, like how Vishal Sikka says, right? And they have set of processes, and by no means this processes should not be taken lightly. They have evolved over a period of time to ensure that there are certain guardrails or safety mechanisms in the engineering process. Now, if you have to take that back into the agentic coding era, it means that some of those processes, how they were embedded, has to be orchestrated by the coding agents, which in a particular manner. And there are two ways to do it. One, you can commission a cloud code or you can commission a existing mechanism like Codex or anything like that, or use a good GitHub Copilot, create sub agents with them and sort of internally orchestrate them. The challenge with that is you are trying to wear somebody's shoes, but it doesn't fit. It is not the shoe of your size, or like it's buying a generic cloth. It doesn't fit you well, or it's even. I mean, that's a easier way to say tell it, but that orchestration is sometimes more clumsier than ever. So that's where we sort of came up with a paradigm, speaking to a large enterprises, saying that, "Hey, can you build something custom for me?" Oh, it doesn't mean that we are not going to use Claude's Anthropic API key or GPT 5.3 Codex API key or so on and so forth. We will be using those models. The only thing we are doing is like orchestrating them differently such that they're able to accomplish their work. So that's the experience about, and we learn a lot doing that because at first, yeah,
Can I ask you to use a different word than orchestration? I mean, it sounds very fancy, but
yeah.
what does orchestration mean?
So I'll take an example. Let's say it's an automotive, or let's say it's an energy, so on and so forth. You start There are a set of design principles that you would follow before pre-coding. Then you would go ahead and the agent may at this stage may not be doing code per se. It is doing all the analysis of what needs to be done. That's also part of your what I can say agent engineering harness that you're putting together. Then the second part of it is again you are not gone into the what code generation stage. You're designing the plans, and those plans have to be accurate enough so that when it is going to be put on hardware or a chip, or even for example a banking and financial process, it is accurate. Then we're going to test driven engineering, design the test so that you know what does the real world implication mean, because you're no more talking about just limited to computer science, a little more than that, and then finally you go into code. So if you really look at it, the actual code generation comes towards a very end of the engineering life cycle, but the more it's more into this design phase. That's where the harness is stronger. In certain industry it could be the other way around. So I think these processes, which are human centric workflows, are part of the harness that we are designing to ensure that we are able to get best power out of the LLMs that we are using today.
Right. And this is literally chapter three, right? The statement in
Oh
chapter
yeah,
three is saying if you just let agents go wild, right? It
that's
looks very
right.
powerful, but you won't get to your objective. So you're creating those pathways, you're creating those constraints. You're saying that, look, these are the areas that the agents can flow through, whether it is a plan.md or the decisions that you're trying to constrain the agent generation, the agent work to happen. That is his orchestration, right? Is this like saying that you need to actually make sure that the agents are going in a certain way, they are within a certain guardrail, they are allowed to do this, they are not allowed to do this, so that it can achieve the objective of like the energy vertical, like you were talked about. It is like making sure that if it is generating code, then it is compliant with certain things, and it is not making these mistakes, and it is actually learning from the mistakes that was done in the past. And how do you orient and how do you guide the agent? That's what orchestration means, right? In a similar way than the way you do playing of orchestra, saying that you should play this and you should play this because
Yeah,
all of you come together, and then it is a cogent music, like something that like is desirable. It sounds like a
absolutely.
fancy
Orchestra.
word, but that is
Yeah.
what the shift is happening. And you're not coding, you're saying, agents, I tell you where all you can go to do the code.
Yeah. Oh, spot on. It's exactly like the orchestra that happens, right? When you're creating music, that one instrument has to play a particular tone and a particular note, while other instrument is maximizing something like that. So I think that's exactly how a symphony is created. And in enterprise coding agents, a similar model is required, and we need not fit into somebody's way of working. This design uh, is not correct by any means, because we are catering to legacy that has existed for years and years together. For example, I mean, if you go to the airline industry, the aircraft flies for 30, 40 years. There's a long life cycle of that aircraft. Then if you go to engine design, it has its own life cycle. So just because that we have rate of change of software is high, doesn't there's no imperative that the real world technologies which have millions of dollars of investment need to change at the same rate. So I think these processes are guardrails around the industry specific nuances, and that's where we are bringing this orchestration or harness around it.
And we actually talked about this in one of the earlier episodes, where
Yeah,
every 19 days a new model is coming. So
yeah,
one thing that becomes like a big thing for any CTO to do is to make sure that they have designed their harness in such a way that when there is a new model that is coming in, then there. I mean, in your metaphor, that the airline doesn't break because we changed, like the
yeah,
engine every 19 days, right? So and every 19 days a new
yeah.
sort of model is coming, and like folks are saying, oh man, like what is going on, right? So how do you actually design things, right? What are all the things that you have learned in terms of failure in your past, like model slash engine adoption, and then have you captured it, and then when you are like plugging out and then putting a new model, then are you still hitting some of the outcomes that you were actually thinking about? And this is like you said, I thought when you said airline, you were talking about regulated industry. That was the metaphor, but in regulated industry it is so important, right? If you had a compliance, you built a harness around a model, and then the model changed, did the harness break? Did the car brake because the engine changed? The airplane brake because the engine changed? So how do you actually think about it becomes important, right? And that is why I think in 2026, like the engineering work that you will do on harness is going to be far more important than like which model to pick, how to do, and like what is the cost of the model, and like how effective it is, right? So that's why I think harness engineering is getting a lot of attention, because that guidance, that orientation, that orchestration is important. Is there any specific chapter that you specifically liked, Kashi,
Oh,
writing?
I think when we were writing this together, I felt the conversation around architecture as a decision first is a first decision as a very important chapter for you to consider. I want to add a note to that, not specific to the chapter, but say things are going to change. The decision we make today may or may not hold good tomorrow. So we have to sort of like design this like as a evolving architecture pattern by first principles. There's a beautiful example that's there in one of the states in India, which is Manipur. They build bridges using banyan trees or all this trees. So the trees' roots are stretched across the river banks, and eventually, as they mature, they become the bridge. So they are having a foresight that when the tree grows, it will become the bridge by itself and becomes a living bridge. So similar to that, we know that the landscape is evolving. And as it evolves, it'll become only stronger and stronger. So how do you start thinking in terms of first principles, such that your architecture is the foundation, and how it itself can change over a period of time? I think that's something we spoke about partly in the architecture is the first decision chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Makes sense. There are like, many things that I think is covered in the book in terms of best practices from companies like Block, Square,
Yeah.
HubCode, who are actually taking a lead on doing this. And the reason for us to actually come back and do this is that, many folks are realizing that you need to be in control of your harness as well as the model. You don't want to
Hmm.
be held hostage, and you start out by making sure that a use case is working. See, coding agent, nobody is questioning coding use cases definitely work, but then in coding agents, people are saying, hey, what beyond Anthropic, what beyond like rented intelligence platforms that are out there? How do I actually have my own models open source and then make it relevant for my own use case, my own industry? But then how do you do things beyond that, right? And that is the harness discussion that we are talking about. So a few things that actually stood out for me is
Yeah.
that how do you define your failure.md file? Make sure that you're learning from things that are like learned. Like you ran an agent, you ran a use case, so you had an agent, ran a use case, and then there was some learning. But then the next time of agent use, is it actually leveraging that or not, right? And is that getting stored? And one of the things that we saw from our Akash conversation was that he was saying his biggest moment was is to actually create that MD file where he said every time there is a mistake, go fix the mistake and then store it back into the MD file. So the next run is always picking back from it. Like people are giving fancy terms to it called as continuous learning and things like that. But like this aspect of saying that look, I make the run, but I'm gonna learn something, and the next time I do, I'm not gonna forget it, and then I'll make sure that the agent is picking up. That makes it so much more important, and it changes the impact of like the outcome in a pretty big way.
That's really important. Rajan, I wanted to ask a question. While we covered a lot of enterprise, I strongly believe even startups can benefit from it. Would you want to add a small thought, because you're well versed in both enterprise and startup ecosystems? How can startups sort of benefit from harness engineering, or when should they start looking at it?
Yeah, I think a lot of startups should already be playing with open code, right?
Yeah,
And what Dharmesh did, like he forked open code to build hub code. I think that is something that startups should start looking at. One of the
yeah,
things I know that a lot of people will hit a roadblock at, like whenever there are like reliability issues on Anthropic, which has been a lot more frequent these past few days. Uh, you'll be like, oh man, like you'll have withdrawal symptoms, right? You're like, oh man, this is working, I can't do anything. So for that alternative, you have to actually have your open code and Kimike2 combo sort of running. That would be one when like there is a reliability issue. The other is that now I hear people coming back and saying, "Oh, I have $5,000, $10,000 that I spent. One of my engineers actually blew this much." You will start seeing that that cost adds up, it piles up, right? So you want to start thinking about like improving an inference and cost of token. And that's when again, when you use something like an open code on Kimike2 or other open source optimized models, right? Then you can bring your inference cost down. So I would say the short answer is the moment you're hooked to Anthropic Cloud Code, you need to immediately start looking at alternatives, because you'll have withdrawal symptoms, and you'll find that that hobby in life is very,
yeah.
very expensive to maintain. I know Anthropic folks are subsidizing a lot, but there will be a day where they'll be like, okay, now I know you're hooked, I'm going to raise the prices, just like how it happened with AWS. And then you'll be like, look, I don't have an alternative. So startups, at least if you are hooked onto it, I would say find immediate replacement, and there are open source options that are there. And the drive for enterprise is different. The drive for enterprise is more about control, right? The drive for enterprise is more about like am I sovereign? Like do I have my entire stack that is running on my premise, and I don't have to worry about like my data going out there. But for startups, the trigger is different.
Yeah, I would like to add to what you said, right? If you're a startup founder who has not yet started, if you look at all the company acquisitions that have happened over the last few months and years, they have been the they have been in the orchestration space. Be it the coding tools that got acquired or the recent news, right? Meta acquired Maltbook. Maltbook is nothing but orchestration. So it got acquired. Yeah. And to some extent, Zendesk acquisition of Forethought is also in the similar lines. In short, for the ideas that you're going to start now, I think orchestration layer is a great place to start, not necessarily the model layer, while we have been the big fans of model layer. So if you're not started, there's still an opportunity to play in the orchestration layer game. It has a huge play even for you.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
So probably we'll come to the wrap of it. I'll just talk about 2 points. So Rajan and I have been working on this. So give us a cheer as you go through the book and give us a feedback, because there's a living copy. Everything that we do while building a coding agent or any other orchestration engine, that is coming back as a feedback into the book. So it is going to be a living copy. So give us a feedback of what you think and what we need to add. And we have simple coding, simple checklists. So if you're building your own agent, what were our learnings? We have converted them to checklists. The failures, so that you don't repeat the mistakes that we made. 10 ways your coding agent will fail is also documented here. And if you want to add to the checklist, drop us a note on LinkedIn, or we are even more popular on Twitter nowadays. So drop us a note even there.
Yeah. Also want to do a shout out to Hexaview Tech, right? So they hosted
Yeah.
an event and which is now moved to April, and like they provided us a lot of resources that is needed for us to actually test it with real clients and customers, right? So big shout out to them for the resources as well as the event that is going to be in April.
Yeah, and I think you rightly said we are using this technology right now at Hexaview. But having said that, we are open sourcing the learnings that we have gone through this to the entire world. So if you want to build your coding agent, reach out to us at Hexaview so that we are able to help you embark the journey. Or if you're not building a coding agent, want to build any other orchestration, feel free to drop us a note. On that note, we'll call it a wrap. Looking forward to your feedback. Yeah, see you all.
See you.